Hello there, here I am. I'm back, and this is the first lecture for part 4 of the course. We just finished going through a whole bunch of lectures and doing a section about internal human organ systems and how humans function through all those systems. I'm kind of making a transition now to outside of the body, but it's a transition that takes a little bit of nuance. I'm going to give a lecture about reproduction and development, and then I'm going to give another lecture about disease and immunity, because birth and death are the two things that have an influence on how many humans live on this planet, which is really the key number, the key issue when it comes to how humans interact with all of the biological systems around them. This is lecture number 31, called Human Reproduction and Development. I've got some sections here in the human biology text that you have access to, and I've got a funny that involves Dilbert. I don't know if you're familiar with Dilbert. It's kind of like that television show, The Office. Dilbert works in an office, and he's got all kinds of weird people that work around him, and sometimes they have some strange ideas about how to be productive and how to live their lives, and it all is through office interactions here. So in this case, Dilbert is the one with the flat head, and somebody else is talking. I'm not sure who this person is, but he says, I've given up on the whole dating scene. I've decided to reproduce by asexual cell division. Dilbert says, I didn't know that was an option. And this other fellow says, you never know until you try. So he's trying. He's really, really trying. Now, we talked before about asexual and sexual reproduction. Humans are sexual reproducers, but I'm going to do a little review of that. And this is just my thought about how humans might be thinking about reproduction and the frustrating aspects of it, the social aspects of it, and of course that has an influence on birth rates worldwide. So it's funny, but it's also maybe a little bit relevant. Divide, divide, divide. If that was if it was that easy to reproduce, maybe that would change some things in terms of the way that we approach reproduction today. All right, let's get started. Okay, so I said I would review this, and it says review at the top, so you know that this is maybe something you should have an idea about already. There are two major types of reproduction among all living things: asexual and sexual reproduction. And asexual reproduction is basically cloning. It's basically making an identical copy of an organism so that then you have two. Started with one, then you have two. It involves only one parent. It's the one that's getting a copy made of it. And the offspring are genetically identical. That means they have all the same DNA inside. It is exhibited mostly by single-celled animals. There are a few animals that are larger that do it, and I've got some examples here. It's actually fairly common among plants and fungus. Those do asexual reproduction all the time. But among animals, it's not quite as common. And since humans are animals, it's important that we kind of have some examples of asexually reproducing animals here. There is an anemone, which lives in the ocean. It's kind of like it's the animal that Finding Nemo lived inside of. And an anemone can just split into two separate anemones, just divide into two organisms that are genetically identical. Here is a little flatworm down here. It's called a planarian. And if we pull it out of a pond or a stream and cut it in half, each half grows into a whole worm. So that's a form of asexual reproduction. Each of the two that form are genetically identical. This is a little starfish. And sometimes starfish get bitten in half. And in this case, this one had it got bitten so that only one of its arms remained. But basically what happened was this arm grew another body onto it. So it's still asexual. There's somewhere around there, somewhere crawling around, there's another starfish with one little short arm. They are genetically identical because these are all examples of asexual reproduction. And we know that that is occurring through mitosis. There is no forming of gametes. There is no fertilization. None of that happening. Asexual doesn't involve meiosis. Okay, sexual reproduction, that's the second form, has to have two parents. Why? Because each parent makes gametes, eggs and sperm. And that's the case with plants, and that's the case with fungus also. Just because we're talking about eggs and sperm doesn't mean we have to be talking about animals. So eggs and sperm, sperm meets egg. Each of those is haploid. They meet, they form a diploid cell, which then grows into the adult organism. The key here is that all of the offspring are genetically unique from their two parents. They are a combination of the two, and we talked about why that is, because we talked about the way that sperm and eggs get formed and how all of the genes get all shuffled around. So it occurs by meiosis or gametogenesis, which is the formation of gametes, and then fertilization. So that's how humans do it. We haven't gotten to the point yet where we can just take an individual cell and make a new organism out of it, although I'm sure people are trying that in some place at some time. And then, okay, got there. So, asexual versus sexual reproduction. Okay, so here we are talking about humans and sexual reproduction because all animals are sexual reproducers, but I don't want to give you the impression that all animals are doing it the same way as humans. And we're talking about reproduction now because there's lots of different variations on it. So what I've done here is I've taken a slide that has lots of modes of animal sexual reproduction in it, and I have put everything that applies to humans in red. And you can see that there's lots of things that aren't in red, so we need to consider the way that other animals do this so that we understand the meaning of these terms. So first of all, humans are allogamous. That means that there are two different types of gametes, sperm and eggs. There are other animals that they just produce two gametes that just meet, and they can actually, even though they're genetically different from each other, they look the same and they don't form what we would call sperm and eggs. You may have heard that humans, males and females, have Y and X chromosomes, and so we have an XY chromosomal system. But there are lots of other animals that have different systems. There's ZW, there's XO, there's ZO, there's haplodiploploidy. Birds are different, insects are different, especially things like bees and wasps and stuff. Very different. Can't assume we're going to have the same type of system just because it's an animal. Humans are dioecious, which means two separate houses. Literally, in Latin, it means two separate houses. It may be Greek. So that means that the males are producing sperm and the females are producing eggs. But that's not the case with many other animals. Hermaphroditic is a term that describes lots of invertebrates, like earthworms are both male and female at the same time. So when two earthworms meet each other, each one fertilizes the other one's eggs. And that's a really different system. There's also some animals that are parthenogenetic, meaning there's only one sex, but they have some behavioral activities that they go through that simply cause another individual to start dividing cells and do something that's meiosis-like. Anyway, so far I'm talking about eggs and sperm, X and Y chromosomes, and males and females with eggs and sperm in two different types of individuals. Next, we're not talking about sex or gender anymore. We're talking about where fertilization takes place. And with humans, it's internal. I guess it doesn't have to be because we have, test tube babies now. But with humans, it's generally internal. With lots of other animals, it's external. There are lots of animals in the world that just spray their eggs and sperm around, and they meet in the water, or they meet, in a clump somewhere, and then that's where fertilization takes place, and that's where the eggs develop, and then the little baby animals are created from that. So that's fertilization. There's also internal and external development. Humans, their early development is internal. This is called gestation, where the babies are developing, getting larger before they're born. Again, not all animals do that. This is unique to mammals. There are a few fish that do it and maybe a few lizards, but most other animals development is external. Okay, think of a bird with eggs, and the eggs, the little baby birds are growing in the eggs. That's external. The next thing I have here is that humans are brooders, which means that they hold onto their offspring and take care of them for a very long time. This is called parenting, right? They take care of their offspring and they don't have a lot of offspring. You might think that some people have a lot of kids, but compared to mayflies or ants or something like that, humans don't have a lot of offspring. So we often distinguish between brooders and broadcasters. Brooders have fewer offspring and take care of them to make sure that they survive. The next thing here is viviparity. Viviparity means that humans are actually born alive, outside of the egg, ready to breathe air, ready to be in the environment that they're going to grow up in, as opposed to ovuloparity or oviparity or ovoviviparity, which is what a lot of fish do and a lot of reptiles and things of that nature. Obviously, birds aren't growing up breathing air when they're inside the egg, so that's not viviparity, that's not live birth. That's what humans do. And then the last one is one that you might have scratched your head about because of the cultural meaning of the word. Polygamy, which we often associate with having multiple spouses, actually literally means sharing gametes with multiple mates. Gametes, poly is many, gamete refers to the gametes. So it has nothing to do with marriage at all, which is a completely cultural thing. And you'll see that I have I've made the word polygamy red, even though when we use the word to describe marriage, we like to think that humans are naturally monogamous, meaning they only have one spouse. But I think we all know that they're not. And polygamous means that humans are capable and readily exercise the behavior of sharing gametes with multiple mates. Probably guys do that a little bit more, but polygamous nonetheless. Okay, there we go. So I've highlighted those red terms. They all refer to humans. Okay, here we are. All other animals aside, focused on humans, and we're talking about reproduction. And so these are the organ systems that have to do with reproduction. A lot of technical terms here, probably a little bit more advanced than what we get in sex ed in 5th or 6th grade. But I guess what I'm here to tell you is that there's actually a lot of similarities here. Here in the female system, we have an ovary, which is producing gametes, which then travel through a tube, eventually reaching a place where fertilization takes place. Down here we have the male, the testis, producing gametes, which are sperm, which then travel through a tube, eventually to get to the place where fertilization takes place. It's just that fertilization actually takes place in the female reproductive system, and so there needs to be a creative way of getting the gametes there. And that's where the processes of reproduction and sexual behavior, intersect with each other. So that fertilization, I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail, that fertilization kind of takes place right about here. So the sperm has to actually make it all the way up into the fallopian tube before that happens. Anyway, like I said, I'm not redoing sex ed class here, but I did want you to know that when we look at early in development at a maybe an embryonic human, there's kind of a generic system that hasn't decided which way it's going to go yet, and because there are glands involved, remember ovaries and testes are glands that produce hormones. Because there are glands involved, there are chemical signals, and in this case, testosterone is one that has a huge influence. If testosterone is present, then we have we go down this pathway, and the generic system kind of develops into the male reproductive system. And if we have no testosterone present or less testosterone, then we go down this path to the female reproductive system. And not only are there similarities in the adult anatomy, but there seems to be, the opportunity to go in either direction very early on. So I think we're getting an appreciation for how much more of a continuum this is, and not necessarily two completely unique men are from Mars and women are from Venus kind of concept. So Obviously, we're going to be dealing with that for a while. So let's just go on from this. We don't have to have a sex ed class. Okay, here's a slide that kind of contradicts what I was just saying about men and women being similar, because in this case, this is not anatomical, but this is about the strategy of producing gametes. Very different. So in this case, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, but it has to do with how many gametes they produce and how they spread them around. I'm not necessarily talking about humans here. I'm talking about males and females. Let's just say I'm talking about mammals, okay? So I can step outside of the cultural issues, but clearly these things have an influence on human behavior. So what I want you to know is that the testes produce sperm, and sperm are cheap and abundant. By abundant, I mean 400 million sperm per load. That's the nicest that I can put it. But they are produced all the time, all throughout the life cycle, and this is true of humans and of lots of other animals, lots of other mammals as well. Over here with the women, the females, sorry, don't necessarily have to be talking about humans. With females, there are about 400 eggs that are capable of being produced through the entire life cycle, okay? Women are born with all of the egg producing cells that they will ever have. One egg or maybe two eggs are released for every menstrual cycle. So I like to say, while sperm are cheap and abundant, eggs are expensive and limited. Clearly, these different strategies might involve different types of behaviors. So we might expect males, not necessarily men, but males, and this is the case with lots of other animals, to be more likely to be spreading their seed in lots of different places, because that would be the strategy of having the highest reproductive output, whereas females, which not only have a limited supply of eggs, but then have to carry the offspring, might be a little bit more conservative in terms of their reproductive behavior. I'm not drawing any conclusions from that, but this does have an influence on the reproductive behavior of lots of other animals, and we would be naive to think that it didn't influence humans. At this point, we do so much thinking and so much talking, and we have stepped outside of the process of evolution, that I'm not going to give men an out just because sperm are cheap and abundant. And if you give them a break because you think evolution drove them to be dogs, that's not something that I'm going to engage with, because I think that we need to, if we're going to change the way that birth rates are going on in this world today, we need a lot more responsibility in terms of this. So I don't necessarily need to explain these. I really just wanted to get those two concepts across. Gametogenesis takes place in the gonads. Sperm are cheap and abundant. Eggs are expensive and limited. And so that influences the way that reproduction occurs. Okay, so this is a little diagram of the glands that are involved and the hormones that are involved in gametogenesis. And it's a reminder, because we did talk about the endocrine system, it's a reminder that gametogenesis is an endocrine process, which means that there are hormones that are released to control when gametes are produced and how they might run into each other. I've got a list of the hormones here, and I've got them kind of with different colors. Some of them are green, and some of them are red, and some of them are red and green. I did that because with these diagrams, it's basically showing that green is saying go, go, go. We have, for instance, follicle stimulating hormone, which is being released by the pituitary, which then tells the ovaries to start producing eggs. Go, 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 we're gonna make some gametes. The red bits are when certain hormones say stop. So green is go, red is stop. And so estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, and inhibin are all hormones that stop the process, but you'll notice that estrogen has a little green and a little red. Testosterone has a little green and a little red. We see them playing both roles. So for instance, here's a place where estrogen is green and is saying go, and here's a place where estrogen is red and is saying stop. you can see that it also is involving the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the ovaries and down here the testes. So when we went through these glands, we learned that there was a lot of releasing of chemicals and communication taking place to maintain homeostasis, stability. We don't want to be producing too many eggs. We don't want to be producing, we don't want to be hormonally active to the point where fertilization doesn't take place properly. We need to maintain stability, which is why there are some hormones that are saying go, others that are saying stop, and the timing of that is very important in terms of when gametes are released and when fertilization takes place. So I don't need to explain these. I just want you to know it's about the glands. Sometimes the glands are saying go, sometimes they're saying stop, and that's happening in both men and women with the red and green hormones here having influences as I indicated. Okay, so all the gametes get made, all the glands are communicating with each other, the anatomy works, and all of the gametes are in the right place at the right time. And this is what we think is happening next. But I believe that I told you when we discussed meiosis that this is completely wrong, okay? What we have here is pictures, and it's very common, of sperm swimming toward the egg. Even the idea that I call it swimming is a little bit incorrect, because they move, yes, but it's more like random movement. They cannot sense anything. There is no little face on the sperm or nose or eyes that are looking where they're going. And no matter what kinds of voices we give them in the movies or the cartoons, it's random movement, which is why there needs to be so many of them, 400 million, okay? So let's try to eliminate this concept from our idea about fertilization. And let's look at something that's a little bit more realistic. Okay, so this is a little bit more realistic. Here we are in the female system, and we have some oocytes that are undergoing meiosis to produce eggs, making haploid eggs, and those eggs are being released maybe one or two at a time. And then here in the fallopian tube is where fertilization takes place, because the sperm have a long trip. And they're not really swimming. They have no sensory systems. They're moving randomly, and some of them make their way all the way out here into the fallopian tube. Fertilization takes place, and then we start this journey down the fallopian tube, so that by the time we reach the uterus, which is what we're talking about here, we are at an 8-cell stage, maybe a 16-cell stage. And then we're going to form something called a blastocyst, which is a hollow ball of cells. Nothing really fancy, small hollow ball of cells, day 8 or 9, and that is going to implant on the wall of the uterus, which has a lining which is full of nutrients to help that embryo develop. Okay, and if, of course, no fertilization takes place and no zygote is implanted, no blastocyst is implanted, then of course that lining has to be eliminated, and that's what the menstrual cycle is. So this is what we're talking about, and this has a couple of elements in it that are important to recognize. First of all, where fertilization takes place, but also going through these stages of cleavage and then morula and then blastula, because this is not just something that humans do. This is something that all animals do. And so we can see the connection between humans and all the other animals, which is one of the ways that we understand humans, by comparing them to other species. Okay, so here's the sequence for all animals, all early animal embryonic development. We have zygote, which is a fertilized egg, and then they start dividing, that's cleavage, and then we get a morula, which is a solid ball of cells, up to 32 cells. Then we have a hollow ball of cells that we call a blastula or a blastocyst in the case of humans. And then we get to something called a gastrula, which is really where the implantation takes place. And that is where part of the outer bit of the hollow ball of cells has folded in, so that there are now 3 layers. So we have pictures down here. Here we have a, let's just change my color. Here we have the first cleavage of a zygote. We have a morula over here, which is a solid ball of cells. We have a blastula, which is a hollow ball of cells. And then when that folds in, we then call that a gastrula. And that's important because it means when that folding in happens, it means there are 3 layers of cells at that point, or 3 regions. There's this blue stuff on the outside, which we call ectoderm, and that's going to become the skin on the outside. Makes sense. There's this kind of greenish stuff on the inside, which is called endoderm, and that's going to become the digestive tract, which we know is a hole that goes all the way through the inside of an animal, including humans. And then we have this red stuff in the middle that we call mesoderm, and that's going to become the muscles and the nerves and the gonads, okay? So the fact that we're dividing up this very early embryo into these 3 layers is going to be the case with all animals and with humans, and it kind of relates to what we learned about all the different systems, all right? I don't care if you know that humans are bilaterally symmetrical deuterostomes. I may have mentioned deuterostomes in an early lecture when we were looking at all the different types of animals. Deuterostomes are animals where the mouth develops somewhere other than the blastopore. Okay, you see this opening right down here? Let's see, it's yellow. This is the blastopore. That's the opening from the folding in, okay? If the blastopore becomes the mouth, then that animal is called a protostome, which means first mouth. If the blastopore becomes the anus and the mouth opens somewhere else, it's called a deuterostome. So among all of the different animals, there are really only 2 or 3 phyla of deuterostomes, and the 2 that we talk about the most in zoology class are the chordates, which includes vertebrates, which includes us, and the echinoderms, which is starfish, which is a really weird group of invertebrates that are the most related animals to the vertebrates, which is kind of odd. Anyway, humans are bilaterally symmetrical. That means same on 2 sides, deuterostomes, and they all go through this process of development. This is the earliest stage of development. Okay, so we have some anatomy, some glands, some gametogenesis. Gametes get created, they get released. Then there is some behavioral interaction, and fertilization takes place. We go through the early embryonic developmental phases before implantation, and that stage that we call the embryo continues until like the 8th to 10th week. And that's what we're showing right here in this Carnegie stages, and it's one of the reasons I don't quite understand the new law that they're considering in a lot of the South, including South Carolina. They're calling it a fetal heartbeat bill. So the reason I don't understand is because the fetus doesn't really start until, say, week 10, week 12, and they're talking about week 6. So it just anatomically doesn't make a lot of sense. But anyway, we know that we're going through these processes of development in the uterus to the point that it begins to become notable, and we know that gestation through all of the fetal phases goes on for 9 months, but obviously birth can occur earlier, and so we have a lot of medical intervention that can keep younger fetuses alive because they're not quite ready to be outside of the womb. And obviously the availability of medicine worldwide, and the availability of parental planning, and the availability of even the ability to parent the children afterwards is going to vary significantly. But the process is the same everywhere. So we have a lot of social and cultural and legal issues that have an influence on the outcome of this process. But this is, like I said, just the biological side of it. Okay, so I'm at about 30 minutes. This is my last slide. It's a little bit creepy because what we're doing here is we're taking the scale of the newborn. So we went all the way through the process to birth. We're taking the newborn and then scaling it up so that it's the same size as an adult so that we can see a lot of the changes in morphology that take place. I know that a newborn doesn't stand up like this, but if you stretched it out and looked at it compared to an adult, you can see some of the changes that take place. We start with a really huge head and tiny legs, and then eventually the form of the body changes to what we see here. We often call young animals juvenile, and when they reach reproductive maturity, we call them adults. Adults in this case has nothing to do with being able to vote or drink. It is simply being able to produce gametes and reproduce. So this would be an adult at puberty, which I guess is about 13, 14 these days, maybe younger than that. Anyway, clearly there are a lot of changes in form that take place. You social work people, you know that there's also a lot of changes in cognitive function, a lot of changes in social dynamics that happen. And thankfully, we've kind of recognized as a culture that most young people at puberty aren't really ready to be parents yet. They're ready biologically to be parents, but not socially to be parents in the culture that we've developed now. So even though this is kind of a cycle, we would like to put some limits on that, and that's what the discussion about human population growth is all about. What kind of limits should be put on when reproduction should take place and how it should take place. That's not something we get into here, but biologically, that's what it takes from birth to puberty, which is where those gametes first start to be released, and that makes an adult able to reproduce. Anyway, here we have the cycle, and then we started with gametogenesis, so this is where we began, and that's all the talk about sex ed that I'm going to be doing, and so we can move on from there. Hope to see you soon, and there'll be some homework up, and I'll try to get going on lots of these lectures so that we can wrap this course up.